Hi, this is Cindy Falteich. Welcome to another episode of What Was I Thinking? In this series, I'm going to be talking about the things that I've done in my life that were considered crazy or irrational, but I'm grateful for all those decisions that I made because they have led me to where I am and allowed me to take advantage of the opportunities that came my way. The greatest thing about making what would be considered crazy or irrational decisions is they always lead to moments of discomfort. And I truly believe, as Neil Donald Walsh states, life begins at the end of your comfort zone. In this particular episode, I'm going to be talking about a trip I took with a professional bull rider about 4 years ago when I was 53 years old. And by God, there were numerous instances in our trip where I was uncomfortable. I blogged about this trip in an essay I wrote that's available on my blog called Abnormal Mom Survival Guide. It's at www.abnormalmom.com. The name of the blog is Don't Pack Your Baggage. Now, the audio for that blog is available at the end of this video, so please stay tuned afterwards because I've equated this with a situation where my son walked into my office one day and asked me if he and his friend could take a short road trip. And of course, my first impression was, you got to be crazy. But then I thought to myself, sometimes you have to be. So please stay tuned at the end and listen to the audio. And as usual, if you have any questions or need anything more, want me to expand on these ideas, or want to share anything with me that is something that you've experienced, please don't hesitate to do so. You can go to my website, www.cindyfalteich.com, go to the bottom where it says Contact, click on that, and send me an email. What I'm going to talk about today is the backstory to that blog that I didn't write about at the time. This trip afforded me a number of what was I thinking moments. So let's get started. Now, the reason this trip came about was because I had written a book called The Revolution of Charlotte Smith. That's a selfless plug. It's based against a backdrop of the Professional Bull Riders, the PBR. And my friends knew that I was trying to work my way to the PBR to find out if they would be interested in adapting my story for a screenplay, because I had read online that the PBR wanted their bull riders to be considered like any other sports figures. They wanted them to appear on late night television, and they wanted great movies made about the PBR. Hence my idea. So one friend reached out to me and said, hey, I didn't think about this at the time, but my niece is married to a man who used to ride in the PBR. Would you be interested in me putting you in touch? Of course I was. So they're a wonderful family, a gracious family. They invited me down. I spent a number of days with them, with both him, who we will call John for all practical purposes of this video, and his wonderful wife and his infant, his child, who was probably about 18 months old at the time. Now, I spent a significant amount of time with each of them individually and together, and they're both extraordinary people, each of them very successful in their chosen occupations. At the time, John spoke about wanting to rodeo in the PRCA in the northwest part of the United States with his son, just him and his son. So what I did was I offered to go with him, just in case that would make his trip more probable or more feasible, not really knowing what would happen. So I made the offer. I'll go with you, help you out with your son, with no attachment, and I let it go. A couple months later, I get a phone call, and he says, hey, if you were serious about that offer, I'll take you up on it. So here I was, with the opportunity to go on the road with a young man who was going to ride bulls and his then 20-month-old son. And I took it. I had 2 instructions. I needed to find tickets for both he and his son to fly from their destination to Denver and get a ticket from me to fly to Denver and arrive in close proximity to when they would so that we could hit the road as soon as possible because he needed to ride in a rodeo in Wyoming that night and we needed to make some time. When I left home, I couldn't tell my husband anything more than where I was going to land. I couldn't tell him where we would be going. I couldn't tell him where I'd be staying. I couldn't tell him the rodeos we'd be hitting. None of this information was made known to me. So I looked at it as a great opportunity to spend an extended amount of time in the present moment. I was assuming John, just like myself, didn't want to starve or freeze to death. So I figured neither of those would happen. Besides, we had a 20-month-old child with us. The rest I just left up to fate. The first night he rode in Wyoming and then we hightailed it for Colorado. We didn't make it though. He ran out of daylight. I couldn't keep my eyes open and we pulled over alongside a road in Butte, Montana and went to sleep in the pitch black. And that morning I woke up to this amazing sunrise over Butte, Montana, big sky country. And I thought to myself, the worst of my fears had already happened. We slept in the car. That out of the way, I decided this was going to be an amazing trip. That is, until the second night. We pulled into near a home of a champion saddle bronc rider in the Colorado area. Now, this is what's really cool about the rodeo community. It's seriously a community. If you're in the area and you are a rodeo person and you need a place to flop, everyone in rodeo makes their home open to you. So when we showed up at that house in the middle of the night in the pitch black, the door was open. We knew there'd probably be a lot of people staying there because a lot of people who rodeo in the Northwest at that time of year know exactly where to stay. And we felt our way through the house. I felt for a soft piece of carpet and without a pillow or a blanket because it's all I could find. It was so dark in the middle of Colorado, no street lights, no city light noise, nothing. And I went to sleep. The next morning I woke up. I took my phone, which had died because my car phone charger died as well. I plugged it into an outside outlet and I let it start charging. As soon as I turned it on, I started getting text message downloads. And one of those was from John's wife. It was obvious to me in the phone calls that they had been sharing that appeared to be a little contentious. It was obvious to me that I may have been the subject of some of that conflict. It wasn't the first time that my intent had been misunderstood. And I want to make this clear. I was 53, he was 27. Very good-looking guy. I'm a 53-year-old woman. I look 53, I'm married. I associate with people as people always. I'm never flirty. That's never my intent. My intent is to get to know someone for who that person is, not for some sexual intent that I have. That's never my intent. But obviously, this young woman had interpreted the problem she was having in her relationship as having some type of association with my presence. And in her text message, she told me, quite frankly, she wanted me out of his life and hers. This is the second day of our trip. So I figured there's a couple things I could do. The spectrum was basically, I could just, as soon as John woke up, say, you're just going to have to drop me off at the nearest airport and I'll get out of your life because I don't want to cause any contention. And then the other side of the spectrum was I could put on my big girl panties and find out how to salvage my relationship with John, my intent to help him with this trip, and see if I could patch things up with this young woman. And I didn't really know which side of the spectrum I was going to choose because at the time my feelings were hurt. So I decided to let my phone continue charging, and I took a walk down a gravel road, and I hung out with some donkeys, and I watched a lot of wildlife, and I watched this beautiful sun rise over Colorado, and I focused on just being present, which is kind of sort of a walking meditation. And then I had this idea that I was going to look at the text that she had sent me as if she had the wrong intent, and that I was going to give her the benefit of the doubt and let her know what I thought in a loving manner. And I did. I never received a reply, and I had a conversation with John, not about this text, but later on, after a very disturbing phone call that he had with his wife, I simply offered him a very small piece of advice. And that was that in my experience in my life, if someone is accusing you of having an intent that is not true to you, there's virtually no way you can defend yourself in that conversation because they've started with something that's not true. So if someone starts a conversation about you, about something that's not true, where can you possibly go with that? So all I said to him was, and this was rather unwelcome advice at the time, he really didn't want me interfering, and I didn't want to interfere. I simply wanted to offer him a piece of advice about how he was positioning himself in these conversations. I simply said to him, if I were you, I would simply stop defending myself. You're walking into that conversation hook, line, and sinker. From that moment on, it felt as if a weight had lifted, and we enjoyed the next 8 days watching him ride bulls. He rode 6 straight bulls, meeting all these extraordinary people, sleeping on couches, sleeping on floors, sleeping in actual beds, sleeping in the car, and meeting a world champion rodeo bullfighter, a world champion bareback rider, a world-class entertainer. It was such an extraordinary experience. We played for almost a whole day on this isolated, abandoned beach along the Columbia River Gorge. It was a situation where I was glad that I had approached that what was I thinking moment with some type of grace and poise. Now, the thing about rodeo men is they marry really pretty women. It's almost like the arena floor is a stage and they are the rock stars. So to say that I was self-conscious of my presence around these people is an understatement. And what made it even more awkward is he would introduce me simply as, and this is Cindy. Now, on one such occasion, even though I'd witnessed a lot of people scrunch their brows as if they were interested in more information, there was a young woman who was working a gate which went in and out of the arena at one of the rodeos. And I was very close to her for most of the night because I often played with his son close to the enclosure where he and the rest of the rough stock riders would warm up. And she gave me so many double takes as if she was trying to figure out what the association was. And towards the end of the evening, she actually looked at me and said, I think I get it. I looked back at her and said, oh, did you think we were together? And her face opened with surprise, and I said, no, we're just friends. I'm just helping him with his son. And I could tell that caused her great relief for so many reasons. I think she may have felt very bad for him, like possibly in some type of inebriated state. The two of us had got together in a Coyote Ugly type of way, and he was trying to fulfill his obligation to me for this child that had been born as a result. So there were many awkward moments that led me to believe, like, what was I thinking coming on this trip? Now, back to the revolution of Charlotte Smith. We actually did end up getting someone at the PBR to refer me to somebody who was managing those type of resources for the PBR at William Morris Endeavor. I did submit a script to them, but as usual in this industry, and if you are a rider, or if you aspire to be a rider, there's one thing that would help you to get used to in your journey, and that is to exhibit great patience and get used to submitting your work and then getting what I call the Phil Collins response, which is no reply at all. At least they didn't tell me I sucked. Don't hesitate to hang around after this video for the audio version of Don't Pack Your Baggage. Thank you so much for joining me today on What Was I Thinking? Don't Pack Your Baggage by Cindy Falteich. I avoid vacation. I don't like the inconvenience of packing up and relocating to a place where I can do the same thing I can do from home. It drives my family crazy, but honestly, it's not my fault. Living in Philadelphia with its vast options for entertainment and recreation makes it easy for me to be a homebody. Quite frankly, I'm justified. So in August, when I was invited to go on the rodeo trail with a friend of mine who's a professional bull rider to help with his 20-month-old son, I had no way to refuse, no leg to stand on, no excuses. I definitely couldn't do that in the burbs. The option didn't come out of left field. Knowing previously that his intent was to make this run, most importantly with his son, I had earlier offered my help. Be careful what you wish, for you shall get it. I have a habit of putting things out there. I create visions and then do the easy part. I let go of any attachment to it. In other words, how or when it happens isn't my concern. This particular vision was relatively easy. I didn't have to fish a subtle opportunity from a fascinating situation. He made his statement, I simply offered. In planning the trip, my involvement was minuscule. All I had to do was find 2 flights, one from his departure town and one from mine, that would arrive in Denver at relatively the same time so we could embark. Oh, and pack light. He didn't ask me to ponder where we'd stay, plan the best route, make a list of possible places to eat, or even give blood. Fretting wasn't a requirement. I wasn't quizzed or cross-examined on my needs, habits, or preferences. I didn't Google anything. Personally, I looked at this trip as the ultimate opportunity to practice presence, to live completely in the moment for an extended period of time. If you think this is crazy, you should know I've been called much worse. Recently, my son walked into my office. When I say office, I should qualify that I can touch my bed from my desk. The delineation between my office and my bedroom is contingent on where I'm currently sitting. In any case, my son walked in. At the time, he was 15 years old and his mouth watered for the autonomy of a driver's license. At 3 p.m. on a Sunday, I could feel the anticipation of freedom in his voice when he said, "Can we go to the shore?" We live just over an hour from the beaches of New Jersey, so it might seem like a worthy request. But it was on the cusp of a Sunday afternoon where wrapping up a task was preferable to starting one, and let's face it, I'm not a beach person. I'm sure I looked at him like I'd just smelled shit. No, he countered like a teenager should. Why? Because I'm not going to stop everything I'm doing and drive to the shore. It's 3 in the afternoon. You should have thought of that sooner. Or something like that. I was definitely snarky. He replied, I would go with Zach. Now, I I could analyze the whys and why nots of his statement. I could ponder appreciable ways to present Zach that would make this trip feasible in the eyes of a parent. I could extrapolate my conclusion using his age, social standing, family history, past experience with my child, as well as his perceived successes and attributes. I could rationalize why 2 teenagers in a leased car could or would not navigate to the shore and back, and add to that an extended line of questioning as to what route they would take and how long they would stay. Finally, I could have confronted them with whether they had entertained how to secure that one thing, along with air and shelter, that's the essence of human existence: food. I've seen my son eat. Dessert often becomes another meal, but I've never answered a phone call from him with a quivering inquiry about what to do about his hunger. I didn't attempt to solve for X in the parental algorithm. If parenting is Rome, I didn't want to do what the Romans do. I didn't want to walk like an Egyptian. I didn't want to investigate the usual suspects. Did he have his credit card? Did they know cash is sometimes the only form of exchange accepted? Were they aware that running through a field to steal a watermelon was punishable by law? Did they know lifeguards clock out at some point? Did they know they could drown? From our house, in just over an hour, with normal traffic, you can watch the sun set over the Atlantic. Zach is Philly born and bred, so navigating to the shore is second nature. In the flash following my son's question, I took a breath, blew away all sources of concern, and said, "Sure. What's the worst that could happen? They'd sleep in the car?" In the week prior to my rodeo road trip, my husband asked about my plans. Specifically, he wanted to know where we'd be staying so I could get an adjoining room. A room? I was relatively certain staying in a hotel wasn't in the forecast. He's a rodeo guy. With the average riding percentage in the lower third of the scale, that's a lucrative business for very few. Plus, I was independently funding my part of the trip. Was charging hotel rooms really the way to build character? My answer was simple. We haven't talked about it. In the mind of my particular spouse, that was obviously preposterous. Perhaps distrust at a 52-year-old woman traveling in close quarters with an athlete half her age actually found a way to surface. Even though ew is the emoji I attached to that as a romantic pairing, I wasn't going to broach the issue unless my husband did, because fucking shit up wasn't on my radar. Period. This was a story about an amazing individual, and I was simply there to witness it as a co-pilot. Going on this trip was something I put out there. As I said before, I dream of ways to create a great big vision and then do the easy part. I let go of any attachment to it. But the next step is the hardest. It's the difference between a dream finding form or drying up on the page of a diary. I stopped thinking about it. Sweating the details sucks all the magic out of dreaming. Thinking you know how it should happen is actually a ridiculous consideration. 20 years ago, I had no idea I'd be writing a blog on a computer so small I would be sitting on my bed, in my office, because it ran on battery. 20 years ago, I didn't know that the thought form I'm writing about right now even existed, that I could control my future simply by embracing possibility and letting go of how it happened. If you define it, you limit it. There are multiple ways a dream can come true, all of them equally as viable. I had never entertained traveling with a professional bull rider until I met this one, and when I made the offer to travel with him, I didn't obsess about whether it would actually be him. In other words, how or when it happened, or if that specific dream happened at all, wasn't my concern. Sometimes embracing the possibility of one dream only leads to a bigger dream or a parallel one. Besides, what's the worst thing that could happen? We'd sleep in the car? The first night, we slept in the car. I had put it out there, and that's what happened. I had thought about the worst thing that could happen, and it did. See how this works? The next morning, we woke up to the sunrise over Butte, Montana. It was a postcard personified. Then I slept on the floor of the home of a former world champion bronc rider, the couch of a national champion rodeo bullfighter, the living room of a popular rodeo entertainer, laid in an actual bed in the bunkhouse of the saddle maker who developed the current-day bronc saddle, got a private tour of the Pendleton Roundup rodeo grounds, skipped around wildfires, slept in a tent next to the cattle pens at a rodeo I can't recall, witnessed the world-famous suicide race in Omak, Washington, played for hours on a small, unoccupied beach on the Columbia River Gorge, enjoyed the astounding accommodations at the home of a bronc rider in scenic Buell, Idaho, and finished the trip 10 days after I'd first landed at a Holiday Inn in Boise to catch my flight out the next morning. Not one moment of it did I wonder what would come next. I was simply along to help. It wasn't my trip, it wasn't my car, it wasn't my concern. Besides, how can I show my son how to embrace opportunity if I question it? If me, questioning him regarding a brief trip to a familiar destination, was so invasive that he saw through to my distrust, is that what he would feel in himself? What excursions in life would he subsequently consider? What possibilities would he embrace? If potential presented itself, would he be able to fish the subtle opportunity from a fascinating situation, knowing his mother questioned his ability to stay afloat when he was a gifted swimmer? What if that solo trip to the shore was his way of asking me if I was comfortable with his debut decision for a maiden voyage? A precursor to him asking permission to embrace opportunity. You have to crawl before you walk, right? I could feel the thirst for freedom in his voice when he said, "Can we go to the shore?" Freedom isn't a circumstance, but a feeling. On my vacation, I truly felt free. I experienced it for so long that it became my native language. I want my son to speak it too. Thoughts become things. Share the good ones.